Welcome. I'm Rob Wolcott, and this is Being Human, where we explore the future with the people who are creating it. I'm very happy to be today here in Manhattan with a good friend of many years and one of the most recognized executives in the world, Beth Comstock. Beth, thanks so much for your time today.
Great to be with you. Always enjoy it.
So you talk sometimes about storytellers and story makers. In your career, and certainly your career at GE, you've done both. You've been involved with a company that makes everything from aircraft engines to gas turbines to financing mechanisms. And at the same time, I've spent many years as the chief marketing officer of the company, as the storyteller to try and engage inside the company, outside the company, et cetera. What is the difference and how do these two come together? The storytellers, the story makers?
Well, I like to think in some ways we all have a good story to tell, and we all live our lives in making the story that we tell. For me, marketing was a way to connect with change, what's happening in the world. And I got really excited about the idea of having to make markets, make opportunity. So to me, story making is the ability of making change happen, creating a vision and getting a group of people who want to be part of that. They help make the vision better, real, actionable, and then together you take a set of actions and that vision becomes a story that you make real. So to me, it's that sort of deliberate act. And in storytelling, I think is just a way of connecting with the world, our way of making sense of our place in the world. They actually go quite well together. You don't necessarily have to have made the story to be able to tell it. To me, storytelling is in each of us. I find people often afraid to tell their story. I find that one of the scariest things you can do is to meet someone and go, "Hey, what's your story?"
They're taken aback.
They're taken aback, but we all have one, and it defines who we are. And then, as you were asking, I think to make our way, to make our story requires action.
But in a sense, then telling the story actually creates it in the future because it sets an expectation or a frame, catalyzes people to have ideas to carry them forward?
Yeah, I think it sets the frame. I think you're creating a vision and you're continually reinventing it or shaping it as the action brings it forward. You want it to be real. It's not just magical thinking. So right. Yeah, I think story is the frame for making.
Well, everybody and every company has a story, as you said. At a lot of organizations, the story becomes fairly specific and maybe even sclerotic. How do you take a company that's successful at doing whatever it's doing and start to tell a different story about where the future might go? How do you make that real?
Right. Well, I think it's sort of a conundrum because storytelling is at its best when you're telling. Obviously, ideally you're telling a truthful story. It's about your authenticity. Yet to be relevant in the world, you have to change with where the world's going and hopefully be far enough in advance that you can keep up with the pace of change. Right. So there's that tension. And I think companies often think, well, I'm this way and I'm never, my story must never change. There's an essence of your story. So for GE, if you look at how we've told our story over 125 years, progress has always been that sort of key word or key part of it, but progress changes. It's about making change, and so every time has to be somewhat relevant. And there's a core storytelling. In GE, we're makers. We make things. So that hasn't changed. Our place in the world has changed, but what we do hasn't. So I think there's a bit of storytelling that is making sure you know who you are and where you've come from, and then the context of telling that in where the world is going.
So staying on GE for a minute, you've been there for a while and you've seen a whole transformation in the company, maybe a few cycles. In fact, just in the past decade, we've been through 6 laps of Moore's Law.
Yeah.
What have been the most impactful transformations that you've seen in your time at GE?
Yeah, what's interesting, a 125-year-old company, you don't get to be that old as a company without learning how to change. And for myself, I've been at the company 28 years. I spent a big chunk of it at NBC, so you could say that's GE or not, but it was at the time.
And certainly storytellers.
Storytellers, for sure. I've come to appreciate, in some respects, having that kind of tenure allows you to connect dots and sort of pull a thread through. And I've come to appreciate that sort of vantage point that you can sort of see through time, the narrative that has stayed consistent. The biggest change that I've seen that has proven out. One, just clean energy. The fact that clean energy and the need for clean energy was happening, that GE needed to be part of that, making that and being part of that future. The digitization of the world is something that I've seen when I first started working. I mean, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't something called Facebook. We actually, called people up on the phone if we wanted to get them.
And now some people don't even like getting a phone call.
They don't like
it's
getting
invasive.
a phone call, exactly.
Yeah.
So I just think, I think the digitization of the world is something that I've seen in the course of my career.
So this digitalization also creates a level of transparency, whether that's with suppliers or customers or the public, policymakers. How has that changed business? How has that changed how we have to think about and think and act as an enterprise?
Well, for one, it's just made data more visible. It's made our actions more visible. It's forced us, if you want to be contemporary and if you want to engage with the world, you have to be connected digitally. You have to share things. And people can find it faster if you don't, so why wouldn't you? It's that kind of environment. I think what digital's done for all of us is it's hastened the pace of change. Everywhere you go, I'm sure you see this everywhere you go, no matter what part of business someone's in, they're all like, it's so fast. And often what people is just, can we just get through this bit of change before we start the next? And you can't.
You hear that all the time.
Right, so I think I think the transparency also makes you aware of just so many more issues happening at once, and you don't have the luxury of saying, well, we'll get to that later.
So in this process, what's something that you envision we'll be able to do, or maybe even have to do, 5 or 7 years from now that we can't even do today?
Well, that's a good one, because some of these things you can start to see now. I see in the world at GE, I mean, just the ability to print a part at your factory, at your service station. You don't need to ship it. You don't need to have a manufacturing plant.
Right.
You can't do that now. I mean, you can do it in small ways right now, but I'm talking a very sophisticated, let's say, gas turbine part. Some of those are starting to happen now, but in 5 to 7 years, that on-demand manufacturing is going to be much more robust.
And I don't think people have really internalized the magnitude of change that will drive. Today we have a global supply chain optimized for scale manufacturing at a distance. The larger your plant, the lower your costs. Right. And over the next 30 years, we'll increasingly have the opportunity to distribute these production capabilities at smaller and smaller levels, closer and closer to the moment of demand.
Right.
And this will rip apart the global supply chain.
It will. It's going to create a huge opportunity for people who've been left out of that. So take regions of the world like Africa, potentially, Australia, where they have a huge mining resource base, and suddenly creates the shift of resource and where things are. So I think that is going to take shape. Look how long it's taken us in an oil-based economy to get used to distributed energy, and that's at a really important inflection point. And I think the latest data I've seen on solar, it says it's gone 3 times faster than even the most optimistic predictions had it.
Yeah.
So I think that has to be factored into this. You may not see it now, it may seem like too far a leap, but it's going to go that much faster.
Right, so in the 1960s, Herbert Simon, Nobel Prize winner, predicted that computers, AI, would be equivalent to a human being by basically the early 80s. He missed that. And so people have a tendency to say, oh, this is all hype, it's going to take far longer, but then we overestimate the near term often, and then far underestimate the longer term and the impact it'll have.
And you know, I think those hype cycles are important. And
what do you mean? Why are they important?
Well, I think they start to give
hype
us...
is important.
Hype
Can I
is
quote
important.
you?
You can. I come out, spent part of my career in hyping things, and I think it's important because it's back to that storytelling. You're trying to get people to, you always have to be outrageous to get people's attention. A phrase frequently used against me in my company by my boss and others is, oh, that's just a cartoon. So I consider myself a big cartoon artist within GE. And at first I think I was offended by it. Now I've come to embrace it because at first it is a cartoon.
Yeah.
At first it is silly, it's fanciful. It can't possibly be true. Or if it's true, that doesn't apply to us. And so you need cartoon artists within your organizations who are willing to hype it and take some of the harassment or shame or whatever
Right.
that comes with okay, we didn't get the time right, but eventually some version of this is going to happen.
Well, that's interesting because many people have said some version, and you've quoted Einstein and others about the notion that if an idea at the beginning doesn't look ridiculous or crazy,
Yeah,
it's probably
there's
not
no
a
hope
very
for it.
good idea. So hype is important. Be outrageous. So you mention often the notion of the global brain. This seems to be relevant to the discussion about transparency
Yeah.
and data. What does that mean, and why is it important to business?
Well, I think in a connected, distributed world, which we've been talking about, meaning 3 billion people connected via the internet, pretty soon, within the next 10 years, 50 billion machines connected via the internet. Machines will talk to machines will talk to people. Hopefully we'll still talk to each other. I don't know, and we'll see where that goes in 10 years.
I think we will be able to, but we will continue to because we desire that.
We do
But
desire
back
that.
in the 19th century when the phone was invented, and you can still find this commentary,
Yeah.
there were people fretting that human beings would sit at home on the phone and never see each other in person again. Obviously that didn't happen.
Yeah.
In fact, it actually increased the amount of time we spent together.
Yeah, and it's another discussion, but at some point you might argue that's happening again. The more connected we are virtually, the more we crave physical interaction.
The more we're on airplanes.
Right. And we go to conferences and we want to learn together. So I think global brain, to me, is this concept that now you can go anywhere in the world to tap into intellect. There is this layer around the Earth that is this intellectual layer. And it's always been in pockets, but it's much more distributed. And so some of the experiments we ran earlier were, putting out challenges to the world saying, can you print this simple jet engine part, and finding a 20-year-old student in Indonesia who could do it. You need those examples to say, well, wow, where else are those ideas? We don't have all the best ideas in our company, in our head, in our team. Where do we go? And now I think we're thinking of going anywhere in the world to get an idea. And what's the interaction of how the machine helps make that data richer, gives you more insight, makes the correlations faster. So this global brain, I think, it's not physical, but it's permeable.
But it's more than metaphorical. I think actually we can start hyping the notion of an intellectuosphere. So
that's
we've
good.
got
There
we've
we
got
go.
stratosphere,
I like that.
ionosphere, intellectuosphere.
Let's trademark
Okay,
that today.
all right, great.
Yeah,
But
we'll
not
share
G,
in
right?
that.
It's just
share.
it's just
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
It's
all
just
right,
us,
great.
yeah.
The intellectuosphere.
Yeah.
And in fact, the discussion I was having right before this one this morning was Slava Rubin, who founded Indiegogo,
Right.
and the observation that he made was before crowdfunding, very few people in the world could tap the world for funding. And now someone in Azerbaijan can throw a campaign up and receive funding from a dozen countries. That wasn't possible 10 years ago.
Right.
And so the same thing goes for
exactly. It's
internet,
exciting.
intellect. So when everything becomes connected and visible, like you've been talking about, what we have this kind of transparency or even hyper-transparency, good and bad. What can we do we couldn't have done before?
Well, it's interesting. One, I think you have hyper-transparency, but I also think people seeking more opportunity to get offline for, the sort of trend, counter trend. So in a hyper-transparent world, I think you're going to find more value in those places that are truly closed, that are truly not permeable.
Like what?
Well, I think we're starting to, people are looking for more, they're going off the grid. They don't want to be connected. They don't want digital messages. I think you're seeing that. I think as we look at technology like blockchain and hyper ledgers, this idea of you have a ledger.
Tokenization of everything.
People are starting to say, well, it's competitively. If I'm a business, I don't want everybody to see every transaction. My competitors can take advantage as I can. So I think you're going to start to see some of those counter trends happening.
It's interesting you bring up counter trends. I've thought for a long time that many of the visions of the future we see in science fiction, et cetera, in films, with the blinking lights and the technological edge to them, is actually not what the future will look like. Because we will desire a sense of authenticity, even if it's invented authenticity, a sense of natural form, a sense of connection. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes actually our living experience as well.
It will be interesting.
So as the world changes, as GE changes, we also change individually as human beings. what have you learned, and you've done this a number of times in your life, what have you learned about reinventing yourself, your place in the world? How does that work?
Well, I've learned a lot from being in one company, and I found GE to be this incredible laboratory for change. You don't stay alive unless you learn how to change.
Right.
I think that's true for people as well. I think if you're in tune with the world, if you're constantly discovering where new ideas are coming from, what's next, you're able to be adaptable. And I think there's a real tension in that, because reinventing yourself doesn't necessarily mean totally changing who you are.
Yeah.
There's a core essence we all have, our uniqueness in the world. In marketing, it's our unique value proposition. I mean, you need to hang on to that for time. But
I want to digress on that for a second,
Yeah.
because you probably get this question from people. I certainly do, from students and alumni and other people, entrepreneurs. How do you find that essence? I mean, it's something that you usually don't know when you're 20 years old. How do you discover what is truly your essence?
Well, it is hard to know at 20. In some ways, I feel like, I'm still
Still don't
figuring
know.
out
Right.
what is my essence. And so in some ways, you find your essence in how you interact with others. You're seeing what people respond to, what they value in you, what they keep coming back to you for time and time again. What gives you meaning? What do you like? I mean, your value may be something you don't like, but what's the point in that? So I think it's a bit of a exploration to figure out what your unique meaning is. And then how do you reinvent yourself? You take that meaning and can make it relevant in the world. For me, I'm somebody who loves change. I love what's next, what's new. That's my story, my mission. It's allowed me to be on the edge of where things are happening, and then try to bring that back and translate it back into a company. But I can't just go like, hey, blockchain's happening, GE, get with it. I have to translate. I have to make it relevant for that situation. So I think part of reinvention is understanding how to make yourself relevant in the world.
And figuring out where in the world to be relevant. I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy, the notion of being all about change, which you definitely are, and loving it, but then also selecting to be within an enterprise that's been around for over 100 years.
Yeah.
It's not obvious.
It's not obvious.
Because you could have gone off to Silicon Valley and said, I'm going to invent companies and see what happens. But you said, I'm going to see what's going on in the world and translate it back into my organization.
Yeah.
So what does this say about, it says something about how leadership needs to change today and going forward. What's different about leadership today than, say, when you started your career?
Well, I mean, leadership has changed so much. I think when I started my career, it was definitely, tops down, command and control, very hierarchical. If somebody said do it, largely people went and did it.
Yeah.
Today, leadership is much more about vision, a strategy, discovery, sort of being open, creating a framework with which people can do their work.
And that's the story again.
That is the story again. I think leadership is about trust and permission. If you're at work and you're waiting for someone to give you permission, you're waiting. And companies don't have time for people to sit around and wait for someone to tell them it's okay. So leadership today, I talk a lot about, I've been fascinated by this concept of emergence as a science concept, and I came to it just because of sort of studying change within GE, and I kept hearing people saying like, there's so much, I'm so surprised by change, we didn't see it coming. Yet it was always emerging, right? And so I have to say to people I work with, we have to get used to the in-between. We're not giving up the old totally, and we're not totally at the new yet. So this idea of emergence really resonated with me as a way to describe it, meaning a lot of things are popping up at once, and you have to get used to, you're not either or in some cases. So for us right now, we're on a journey to be a digital industrial.
Right.
It means digital meets physical. We grew up in a physical world. Now we have to be digital. Are we digital? Are we physical? We got to be both. And people want to say, no, I only want to do one. You can't. Right. So I think that is really where leadership is, sort of saying there's a vision. We're going to have to get used to ambiguity. We're going to have to test different ways forward. We're going to have to plan for different potential future outcomes. We have to unlearn some of the ways we did before. And probably the most important thing, I think, for leadership today is creating the right kind of feedback loops. earlier, quicker, on a personal level, on a team level. So you know if you've given someone the agency to go do it, you have earlier feedback loops to know if it's working. So you don't have to wait 5 years to find out that was a bad idea.
Course correct, et cetera. I often take issue when people say, boy, we didn't see that coming. Unless it's something like initial coin offerings, with blockchain and tokenization. Most people probably didn't see that coming. But most things, look, when IBM in 1999 finally decided to get into the internet, the public internet, it had been around for 6 years or so since the web launched. We all know they had strategy offsites at IBM, they had slide decks, they had people wringing their hands about the internet. They saw it, and they saw it coming, and they saw it growing, but they didn't do what they needed to do to make it happen, to make IBM relevant. How do you help people who have to hit their quarterly numbers now, and they do have to, take the time to look further out and then, as you said before, translate that into a portfolio of options on the future? Because we're always going to be more successful for right now if we focus all of our energy on right now, except that then we don't have a future. How do you do that?
Well, I think it starts with good leadership that realizes their job is to not only optimize today, but build tomorrow. You have to do both, and leaders have to see that. They have to create the space, the courage for tomorrow. They have to make room for people like me, who that's the world we live in. I think one of the great injustices in companies is they don't make room for people who actually see things, seed things. There are people in the world, they don't just all go to startups. They actually like starting and growing things. They don't want to live at scale. They like going from nothing to something. And we tend to think there's no room for those people in our company, and you have to make room for them. And so I think that's what it's about in companies today. And leaders have to realize they're going to take some grief from investors. Investors have to be a partner in that. I mean, I think investors' metrics often are backward looking, they're lagging, they're not forward looking.
They're all lagging indicators. Profitability, revenues, that tells you what happened last week, not what's going to happen next year.
So I think they need to hold us to a standard that says, okay, how are you optimizing today? And I want a much more deeper dive transparency on what are the viable paths? How many ideas are you testing? How efficient are you in testing those ideas? You know, there's actually a lot of efficiency that can come about. I mean, we've adopted Lean Startup, we call it FastWorks, we've done a lot of different things, but most of that is about testing and learning your way forward, and I would think investors would want more of that. It's efficient, it prepares you for the future. So those would be some of the things.
So you talk a lot, and you have mentioned them today, about creativity and about critical thinking and envisioning the future. Ethics in a context of fast change, where we can do things that we could never have done before, becomes increasingly important. What is the role and the responsibility of a corporation like GE to think about, for instance, the application of Internet of Things, tracking assets, tracking people, genetic engineering, CRISPR, you have a healthcare business, for instance. These will happen, and they are happening. So what is the responsibility of a corporation to navigate that?
Yeah, well, I think it's all part of being able to see the future, make room for the future in your organization. That part of that is that critical thinking. I actually could go on a rant if you want me to, I won't.
Please,
but I could,
that's what we're here for.
Just the loss of critical thinking, certainly in the world, but it's affecting business. I think that ability to, while the world's going so fast, yes, we have to respond immediately, but some responses require thought, and they require sort of a red team, blue team approach, this or that. And for now, we are going to take this step until we get new evidence that tells us we're going to change our path. Internet of Things, all of the different scenarios. There are a lot of scary scenarios.
Right.
Are you planning for them, or are you going to wait till they happen? Surely you're not going to know every black swan or whatever phrase. You're not going to know every, but you at least need to game it. You at least need to have had the thought. I think we're seeing it in companies that over the past decade, we've seen it in our carbon and emissions footprint in the world. I think that was, a good early step in that kind of way of thinking ethically and thinking ahead to the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, and actually on that topic, one of the things that we've seen that has worked, and worked in the very beginning of that effort to look at sustainability, et cetera, at the point where it transitioned from just being some people that everyone wrote off about, hugging trees and all this, when people started to recognize, in some cases, I can save money. I can actually be more efficient by becoming sustainable. That was the turning point.
Yeah.
For instance, when Walmart got into it, think what you want about Walmart, they were one of the biggest catalysts for driving
Definitely.
sustainability in the world,
Yeah.
because it's going to make us more efficient. And that starts to shift people's
Yeah, well, I
people's
mean,
minds.
when we first got into eco-imagination, for us it was about being ecological and economical, to
Right.
your point. But you had to say we're a part of this, let's think that forward.
Yeah.
Let's imagine what happens if we don't change the way we work, if we don't change what we do. So I do think there is a think forward kind of process that is ethics. I mean, we think of ethics, we tend to think in companies that it's purely about integrity relating to cheating, lying. I mean, those are bad things.
Right,
But
right.
we don't think about the unintended consequences of some of our technology, of what happens when it starts to interact in the world. I think in a world of driverless car, you're hearing more of this starting to come about, but I
Right.
think it's going to be far more pervasive. I hope we see the return of a corporate ethicist. I think philosophers and boards of advisors that include people who can help steer a company through critical thinking. I think there's a really interesting path for that kind of capability.
A hopeful sign is that the public ethical dialogue in history does seem to percolate when there is a transformative technology that comes on the scene. So, for instance, nuclear weapons would be an obvious example. But there are others, even in the 20s and 30s with quantum mechanics, which the scientists were still trying to figure out, that started to become a discussion in some public realms. So someone I have great respect for, Alfred North Whitehead, a philosopher of science and many other things, he said in Science in the Modern World, society advances by the number of things we can do without thinking. And this was in the 20s and 30s when he was saying this. This is before we really had robots. This is before we had anything like AI. But that's the question we're facing today, 100
Definitely.
years later. So that dialogue was happening at the time, and when it wasn't even as present as it is today, and the dialogues, the realities that companies are facing, like what do we do with thousands of actuaries in the world when in the next 5 to 7 years AI will do that better? And that's a heck of a white-collar job. So, Beth, do you see some of this happening, more of this happening with colleagues in other companies in the corporate sphere? If not, how do we catalyze it?
No, it sure is. I mean, as I hear you talking, a couple of things. I mean, you're talking about the ability to go faster
Right.
and not have to think as much. But now we have to go fast and think more. And I think in some respects,
Great.
for companies like GE, I mean, at our core, we like to make things, but we love scale. We dream in scale. And so the ability to get to scale fast has been a competitive advantage for big companies. Now you have to stop and say, wait a minute, we have to use judgment, and you need more people to have critical thinking skills. Just don't go do it the same way we've always done it. So I think that's really a tension in companies right now. We're seeing it with artificial intelligence. You see it with robotics. That's why I'm so passionate about getting more creativity into companies and trying to get people over their fear of imagination, if you will, because we need to imagine different scenarios. What I've found in some of the colleagues I work with, where you start to introduce algorithmic robots. I mean, think of a group, I'm thinking of a group right now that has a back office function. They're maybe doing accounts payable, and it's a very tedious job. But
Right.
there's one team I know that started to realize, if I could work with my IT leader and get a algorithmic robot to go and sort all this stuff overnight, when I come in the next day, the data's all much better, and I can use my brain and think much more clearly about what we need to do, rather than just keep doing the same thing the same way. So that was a big insight to say, it's about reinventing the process. Let's rethink the process, not try to do the old process faster. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, where critical thinking needs to stop, and we need critical thinkers to stop and say, why are we doing this?
Right.
What's the outcome of this? Then maybe we should start to do it faster and at scale.
So I want to come back to artificial intelligence in a second and ask you, what do you think business leaders and perhaps policymakers need to know about artificial intelligence that perhaps they don't? But on your last point, I had an article in Forbes a couple months ago that speed is not a strategy. One of the things that I'm sure you're seeing as well is everybody's gotten excited about lean startup,
Yeah.
and you have
We have, in a big
you have
way.
FastWorks,
Yep.
which has
Yep.
been extraordinary
Yes.
with some real output.
It's lean, only faster.
Exactly, but adapted
Yeah.
for GE,
Yeah,
adapted
exactly.
for that kind of context. But sometimes it can go too far, and people start saying, well, let's be like startups. Let's just go out and do stuff
Yeah.
and see what happens. That's not a strategy. You still need that story. You still need that frame so that people know within that, this is the direction the company's going.
For me, the idea of going faster is you're testing your ideas faster,
Yeah.
so that by the time you're ready to scale something, you have a degree of confidence. So what's going faster is the risk evaluation and the ability to have multiple ideas being tested at once before you then decide to scale. So rather than doing 5 things big, let's do 5 things small and then figure out what are the 1 or 2 things we're going to go big in.
And hence the need for critical thinking, which is critical design, critical assessment, et cetera. But I want to challenge you for a moment on this notion of critical thinking. Do you think it's really changed? Do you think we have less of it today than we did 30 years ago?
In the world, probably not, but I think in companies at scale, we have gotten so used to following the checklist, the process. I'll give you a great example. This is more, I travel a ton, as you do. I was in the airport at SFO, San Francisco, last year, and we were delayed. The pilot comes out in the gate and says, "Great news, I've been cleared to fly. The autopilot isn't working, but I am so experienced that the FAA has granted me permission to fly us home, and I can't wait. I love flying not on autopilot." And to me, that's a metaphor for what we're talking about a little bit.
What did that say to you? Because you could either be excited or scared.
Well, I was excited once he said, because I have the experience and the judgment, as how I interpreted it,
Right.
to know what to do. I don't need just the machine part of it to tell me what to do. And in those moments of importance, you want someone to know how to listen to the feedback and say, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing. So I think in too many companies at scale, we just keep trying to make the same process better, the same process faster. We aren't saying, is this the right process for what we need to do? And I see it every day.
So we shouldn't be replacing thinking with process,
Yeah, right.
which often we have done in the past.
We have done. I think as in our rush to get scale, often we give up some critical thinking. Now, it can't slow you down to the point you can't compete.
Right.
And that's why I think you need to make room for that kind of both to optimize today and build tomorrow in your organization, so that as you start to get more confident, you've de-risked some of these ideas earlier, you're more confident in scaling in them.
So autopilot is a good transition back to artificial
Yeah.
intelligence. Well, this is affecting all of us personally, professionally. What's something about artificial intelligence that you think we need to have more conversations about, or maybe business policymakers aren't aware of?
Well, I think one of the things that we often forget is that humans are coding and writing the algorithms and the software that creates the artificial intelligence. For now. I think it's much farther out, the kind of humanity eating AI that everybody is fearful of that makes great movies is much farther out than we think. There's some parts of artificial intelligence that are happening today, and I've seen it. It frees you up. It frees your brain up from having to do the manual thinking, the repetitive thinking. It allows you to be creative. I sometimes worry in companies that people actually don't want to be more imaginative, more creative. They fear it. And so it's easier to just keep doing the work the way you've done it, as opposed to have somebody else make your work better so that you can be freed up to solve bigger problems.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I often think of AI as the evolution of our own cognitive systems, from the medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. We don't think about breathing. We don't think about our heart beating, thank God. We think about other things because that's all taken care of.
Right.
And removing the capability line up further and further up to the cognitive, creative, et cetera, experiences that we could have in the future.
Yeah, I think a good test for a team is with some of the AI applications you can find today, a chatbot, a algorithmic robot that can do numbers better. It's a good test of a team to figure out who on the team wants to step up and be more creative.
How do you set that test up? I remember maybe 5 years ago when 3D printing was just percolating, you and your team bought 200,
A couple thousand.
a couple thousand 3D printing machines and sent them out across GE and said, tell us what you find.
Right, and it was a good test because there were people that were like, this is a toy, back to the
Right.
cartoon artist, this
Yeah.
is a toy, you gave us a kid's toy. I mean, what am I going to make, a keychain for my kid? Then there were the few of them that were like, this is stupid, I'm not even touching it.
You made me a metal desk ornament that I still have on my desk.
Those
by
are
the way.
amazing, aren't
Yeah,
they? And
yeah.
the intricacy, and then there was this group that were like, wow, this, you know what this can do? This can give us little tools that we can start to prototype and take to our customers earlier. So we don't need to wait for this to be perfect. We can
Right.
actually print something out, and I can take it over, if I'm an engineer, I can take it over to the product team and say, imagine if these two things did this. Would that be a different way of solving that problem? So the people who actually use it as a discovery tool, it unlocked all kinds of new ways of doing. I mean, we now have an additive manufacturing division. It's creating the future, and that's the way the teams work. They've created all these streams for people to just bubble up ideas for discovery. So that's what that seeds.
And so you can actually do a test without people knowing it. You can throw cool stuff out in the company and see who picks it up.
You can, exactly. And my rule of thumb has been kind of a third, a third, a third. There's a third of the people that are just never going to adopt it. There's a third that they just need proof. So they're going to, and then there's that third that just can't wait to discover.
Can we ever have a 2/3 company where
Well-
we get rid of that 1/3 and never have that 1/3?
Well, I think you probably, I think that's back to reinventing yourself as a person and being somewhat open to what's new and what's next. And if you're fearful of that, maybe you should ask yourself, what can I do to be a bit more open?
So how do you get people over the fear of creativity, over the fear of the future, to the extent there is, and turn them into people who are excited about making it happen?
Well, it starts with a vision and a story. So what's possible in our context, and repeating it, bathing in it, just getting it totally, getting people totally immersed in the story so that they can see a way to contribute to the story. So I think that's a big part of it. And then you have to have small acts that make it real. People need to, back to our 3D printer example, I need to actually print something out and say, hey, I see how this works. I understand this. So I think there's a lot of exposure. It's best done with teams, taking teams together. What I've learned in my career, I wish I had known this earlier, is, I always played a role of, I'm going to go seek and find, and I come back like an explorer from another land, and people are like, that's a nice
Right.
story.
You're like Marco Polo. They
Right.
throw him in jail because they think this guy's nuts.
Well, or it's like
Yeah.
boring, or it's like, I didn't see that. I've learned that so much of change and being ready for what's new and next is that people have to discover it for themselves. You
Right.
can't tell them. You can't teach them. I think learning in companies, maybe you'd know best, but what I've learned about learning in companies is it's people experiencing the new together.
So I'd like to shift to a topic that's important to all of us. It's something that you've talked about a lot, and certainly the stories that you tell, you mention authenticity. I translate that to trust. The issue of trust today, this is a tough one. So Richard Edelman from Edelman and I were talking last month about the Edelman Trust Barometer and how trust in all public institutions, including businesses, has declined precipitously. What can we do as business and academic leaders to change that, to renew trust in business, for instance?
Yeah, well, when I hear that, I think of what I said earlier, that idea of get used to living in the in-between, because what's happened is our old institutions are changing, and the new model of them is not clear yet. And so we're anxious. And I think for politicians, business leaders, people leading these institutions, if you can't paint a picture of what the future is going to look like, how can you expect anyone to believe that you're going to be there for them? And so I think it is a lot of storytelling, a lot of being transparent about when things don't work, when things are in process of being changed, of inviting people in to help you make it better. Too often we think we have to do that in cloak and dagger, and you can't let people know about the change, and you bring it out and say, here, and is it any surprise they don't know what you're talking about?
Right.
So that's how I think trust is. It's about sort of a reality check of where we are, reminding people that there's a vision, and let's do it together. So I think that's a lot of what's happening to organizations is they keep people out, they don't have the vision, and they seemingly don't want to change.
Yeah. One of the answers that Richard Edelman had, which I thought was interesting, he said we all have to become media companies, whether that's GE or Edelman, which is a media company, or Rob Wolcott or Beth Comstock. And that's something actually you've imbued at GE over the past decade at least, about the meaning of media and communication and storytelling as a result of building trust. So Beth, we're writing your story years from now. What would you like people to know about Beth Comstock?
I think what I'd love them to know is that I committed myself to work with meaning, to working with a team of people who could imagine what was next and work really hard to try to make it happen. But really, it's hard to believe this, but it's true when you're there. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of ups and downs. It's not measured by the success. It's measured by how well you navigate it. And for that, I'd hope that is what I could tell.
But you know, we learn when we face challenges. I know it's true for myself.
Yeah.
There actually is research that suggests this. When everything's going great, we don't deeply learn. When the chips are down and we have to try and rise to the occasion, whether we succeed or not, seems to be when we're really learning something.
Yeah.
Looking back at the challenges that you've faced, what has been the most meaningful thing that you've learned through all that?
The most meaningful thing I've learned as I look back at those challenges is just that you have to be open. You have to, the more open you are to what's new, what's next, the more able you are to navigate the change. You have to work with others. It's really important. I mean, it sounds so basic, but I think of my best moments when I've been happiest at work is in the flow. And it's not in the flow of my own ideas, it's in the flow with others. It's a riff, one giving to the other. We're up at our whiteboard, we're creating the future together. And I think that's so much of what work is about. It's about those kind of flow moments together.
So, a last couple of questions, Beth. I have two daughters, Sage and Jolie, 8 and 6 years old. You're the sort of woman that I would love for them to aspire to be. I mean, open, as you said, accomplished, but grounded. What advice would you give to Sage and Jolie as they begin their lives?
Yeah, well, thank you. I have two daughters, not that young. They've grown up.
How old are they?
They're in their 20s.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
So they're grown, and I'm very proud of them. And
you've been through the valley of death, which
exactly.
is called high school.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And every stage is great, but every stage is challenging with them. But I mean, what I love about my daughters is that they're very independent. They know who they are. So for your daughters, I'd say, know who you are, know what your strengths are, and just you can make your way, right? I mean, you can do this. I think that I grew up in a small town in Virginia. I've worked with a company that's allowed me to see change and see the world in a way I never thought possible. You can do this. I think that's really what I'd say to your daughters. You can do this.
You can do this. Okay, so what advice do you have for me?
You can do this. You are doing this. I think this idea of discovery and learning and taking that to the next realm for what people need to do, I think you can be a really powerful force for that. I mean, you've had learning as a construct for what you've done. I mean, think of the innovation network that you've put together. It's really, as I've known it, it's been about a curated, shared learning experience. That's why people come back. They like each other, but they've learned something, and they are hunger for more. So I think you can do more of that in the world.
Great. Last question. 3 words to describe how you feel about the future. Hyphens are acceptable. 3 words to describe how you feel about the future.
Anxiously optimistic.
Oh, okay. Well, that's 2. I give you points for being succinct.
I'm a worrier. I'm optimistic, but I'm also a worrier.
How does that impact you as a leader, as a business person, as a human being?
The optimism or the worrying part?
Both.
I think the optimism allows me to just think that of the positive impact of things. The worrying side means I'm always prepared. I was a good Girl Scout. I'm always ready. I think through every scenario. I've thought of I haven't thought of every, but I've thought of many possible scenarios. So I sort of channel that worry and anxiety in a way to think about the future.
Great. Go fast and think more. Hype is important and be outrageous. We dream and scale. But we also sometimes fear imagination, get used to living in the in-between, because that's where we all live. In life, we make the story we tell the stories we make. Thanks for sharing your story with
Thanks,
us,
Rob.
Beth.
Great experience. Thanks a lot. I love the way you summarized that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.